Greetings, friends. We're continuing our theme of non duality, and the topic for this talk is the mirror of shame. In talk 3, we looked at the Genesis story as an analogy of how we overlook and reach beyond the ordinariness of just this moment, grasping for something out there that will bring us more fulfillment than just this. And staying with this Genesis story today, in Genesis 1 verse 27, we're told that humans were made in the image of God. And in verse 31, that God saw all that was made, and it was very good. However, when we look at the original temptation, it was a reaching outside of who we are to become like God, as dualistically other than who we already are, which is already in nature God. I find this such a clear picture of the mechanism of the ego or false self, our strategies to try to become more like God, more ideal, or at least some improved version of ourselves, rather than just this human shape that I am. A byproduct of this is a self-consciousness that looks at all we are with discontent, self-judgment, and self-shaming. And in our shame about the naked person that we are, we hide from God and each other, clutching our fig leaves and other layers that we create around ourselves to try to make ourselves more presentable, worthy, likable, anything but this shape of humanity that I am. And God's question reverberates to us from this story: who told you that you were naked? Why are you ashamed and hiding? In our dualistic self-consciousness, we're continually looking into a mirror of shame. And then we turn this on one another, projecting our fear and self-loathing and casting blame and shame on each other for our unhappiness. And this just exacerbates this mirror of shame more and more. James Finlay wrote, "From the first moment of my existence, the deepest dimension of my life is that I am made by God for union with Himself. The deepest dimension of my identity as a human person is that I share in God's own life, both now and in eternity, in a relationship of untold intimacy. On the other hand, my own daily experience impresses upon me the painful truth that my heart has listened to the serpent instead of to God. There is something in me that puts on fig leaves of concealment, kills my brother, builds towers of confusion, and brings cosmic chaos upon the earth. There's something in me that loves darkness rather than light, that rejects God and thereby rejects my own deepest reality as a human person made in the image and likeness of God." In a well-known passage in Philippians 2, we're taught that our attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, which is described as who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing. And it struck me that this is the inverse of what is described in Genesis. Rather than grasping onto equality with God, Jesus did the opposite, letting it all go, emptying himself. The word that is used for this is kenosis, letting go, self-emptying. And this shows us the attitude at the heart of non-duality, letting go of our internal narratives of self-consciousness, the self-image that we generate and then gaze at in the mirror of shame, finding ourselves wanting and then turning this on one another. And so this means letting go of the urge to judge ourselves, be fixated about ourselves, or making something of ourselves, all of which are tendencies of the dualistic mind and sadly reinforced by our social media culture. But in this process of letting go, we are releasing into what is described as open, unfixated mind, one that is empty of self-consciousness and all the descriptors that go with this. And this shifts our sense of self into a deeper, more essential true self, which is who we are already. We've got a really serious case of mistaken identity. We are already in God, resting in God, one with God, made in God's image. There's a lovely teaching in the Gospel of Thomas, Logion 37, which reads, His disciples asked, When will be the day that you appear to us? When will be the day of our vision? Yeshua replied, On the day when you are naked as newborn infants who trample their clothing, then you will see the Son of the Living One, and you will have no more fear. When you are naked as newborn infants who trample their clothing, then you will see the Son of the Living One. And the commentator Jean-Yves Leloup, when he was commentating on this passage, he said, Here clothes symbolize all the suppositions and impositions with which we have veiled our essential being. They represent all our identifications with roles and situations, all the ideas that make us forget our nakedness. This gospel invites us to be naked, to be nothing, to be empty as a newborn child without clothes, without prejudices, so as to rediscover that innocence which allows us to see the living one. This need for childlike simplicity is a thread that runs through much of Jesus' teaching, where he went so far as to say that unless you become like little children, you cannot enter the kingdom. He also taught strongly against any form of judgment, saying, Do not judge or you will be judged. You will live in a judgmental, shaming world because this is the shape that your judgmentalism gives it. He also showed us the way out of this, the simplicity of a child. Drop your layers that you hide behind in your shame. Drop your judgments and opinions. Become as receptive, trusting and simple and open as a child. This is not about being gullible, rather it's a moment-by-moment wonder, clarity, and freedom from hard-heartedness and the crusted layers of the self-created self. In Matthew 11, verse 25, Jesus said, I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you've hidden these things from the wise and learned and revealed them to little children. There's a childlike innocence and simplicity that allows us to shed the veils that we've hidden behind, allowing ourselves to be vulnerable and naked of our false faces that we wear to cover our shame. And this shedding of the layers is to come to know our original belovedness, to be reminded that who God made us to be is very good. And as we become more and more convinced of this, our shame dissolves, and we can begin to let go of the layers that we've hidden behind in our fear and shame, and so the cycle reinforces itself, and we become ever more free. In the Acts of Thomas, there's a verse that reads, Henceforth I shall no more veil myself, for the mirror of shame has been removed from me. No more shall I feel ashamed and frightened. I find the story of Jesus' baptism a beautiful image because it involved symbolically discarding outer garments, being ceremonially washed of old patterns, emerging from the water new and fresh, and hearing the voice that says, You are my beloved child. And Henri Nouwen wrote a lot about being the beloved. And he wrote, Self-rejection is the greatest enemy of the spiritual life because it contradicts the sacred voice that calls us the beloved. Being the beloved expresses the core truth of our existence. The great spiritual task facing me is to so fully trust that I belong to God that I can be free in the world. letting go of these layers of self, the clothes we pull around ourselves in our shame, we start to hear the voice that calls us beloved, in whose image and likeness we're already made. This in turn gives us the freedom to let go of the veils that we hide behind, becoming ever more childlike and free. Beatrice Brotteaux calls this being unselfed of self. But rather than being a heavy ascetic kind of spiritual task, the call is to be as unself-conscious, playful, and free as a young child. Mark Nepo wrote, "Dropping all we have constructed as imperative allows us to be born again into the simplicity of spirit that arises from unencumbered being." That's what we're talking about, unencumbered being. And St. Teresa of Avila wrote this remarkable poem. He desired me, so I came close. 1,000 souls hear his call every second, but almost every one then looks into their life's mirror and says, I'm not worthy to leave this sadness. When I first heard his courting song, I too looked at all I had done in my life and said, how can I gaze into his omnipresent eyes? I spoke those words with all my heart, but then he sang again a song even sweeter. And when I tried to shame myself once more from his presence, God showed me his compassion and spoke a divine truth. I made you, dear, and all I make is perfect. Please come close, for I desire you. The inner radiant one holds up the mirror of eternity, in which there is never blame, shame, judgment, or disappointment. Only the tender spaciousness of grace, forgiveness, and belonging. This mirror of eternity, reminds us of who we are as God's beloved and also as the image of God. But we can only begin to receive this mirror when we become simple, childlike, and silent. And I'll end with this poem by Rumi. Be clear like a mirror, reflecting nothing. Be clean of pictures and the worry that comes with images. Gaze into what is not ashamed or afraid of any truth. Contain all human faces in your own without any judgment of them. Be pure emptiness. What is inside that, you ask? Silence is all I can say.
Silent prayer is one of the most powerful ways of letting go of our layers of self-speak and making room to receive the still small voice that reminds us of our belovedness. So I'll guide us in a time of quiet prayer. And just start with reflecting back over the last few days. Can you recognize any ways in which you have shamed, blamed, or belittled yourself? Are these familiar voices to you? And notice the feeling inside you, firstly when you are receiving criticism from yourself, when you are holding up this mirror of shame. And then also feel what this criticizing space in you feels like. What is the shape of that, the criticizer? And now choose to relax out of being the self-shamed and the self-shamer and shift your attitude to one of gentleness. In this way, we're touching on the gentle heart of God, who's always here longing to express through our hearts. Don't try to scold or correct yourself for the self-shaming. The recognition of that is enough to start loosening the habit. So allow yourself to open and release even more, and settle into a time of quiet, resting in God, in the silence. If you notice any thought stream or any stories you're telling yourself about yourself or anybody else, just gently let these go, gently, and feel how it feels in your body to be in this quiet, open, receptive place. This is the place where you receive your belovedness directly from God, without the need for words. In this quiet, open, resting place, you're being bathed in the vast, holding ocean of love. Letting this knowledge of your belovedness seep into your being from our source, the source of love, the source of belonging. So for the rest of this time in silence, when you find your mind caught up in any form of thinking, just keep letting go, releasing and returning to resting in God, in quiet, open simplicity and trust, childlike, simple, free.